The sterile white of the ultrasound room felt colder than usual. For Audrey Davenport, this was supposed to be a pinnacle of joy, the first time she and her husband Harrison would see the fluttering heartbeat of their child together. But the leather seat beside her was empty. The pity in the technician's eyes was a mirror to the dread coiling in her stomach. An hour ago, a text message had shattered the dream. Urgent crisis at Montgomery Global. Can't break away. Terribly sorry, my love. But Audrey knew. In the silent humming room holding her own hand, she knew this wasn't about business. This was a different kind of betrayal, one she wouldn't let stand. The silence in the Bentley was more oppressive than any argument. Audrey stared out at the rain-slicked streets of New York City, the blur of yellow cabs and designer storefronts, a meaningless backdrop to the storm raging inside her. The ultrasound photo tucked into her purse felt like a lead weight. Their baby. A life they had planned, celebrated, and announced to their circle of affluent friends with champagne and curated smiles. Now it felt like her baby, a solitary journey she was already beginning to navigate alone. Harrison Montgomery was not just a husband. He was an institution. The CEO of Montgomery Global Capital, his face was a regular feature in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He moved in a world of 9-figure deals, private jets, and boardroom battles that shifted markets. When he'd swept Audrey, a promising young architect, off her feet, it had felt like a fairy tale. He was charming, brilliant, and devastatingly attentive. He loved her vision, her independence, he'd said. He didn't want a trophy wife. He wanted a partner. For 5 years she had believed him. She'd given up her burgeoning career to manage their estates, oversee their philanthropic foundation, and create the perfect, serene home he claimed he needed to escape the pressures of his world. Their Manhattan townhouse, a 6-story limestone marvel overlooking Central Park, was her masterpiece of design and comfort. But lately, it had begun to feel less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated cage. The urgent crises had become more frequent. Late nights at the office, last-minute trips to Zurich or Hong Kong, whispered phone calls he'd take on the terrace, his back turned to her. Audrey wasn't naive. She was an architect. She understood structure, and the structure of their marriage was showing hairline fractures, the kind that precede a catastrophic collapse. Back in the cavernous silence of the townhouse, she walked past the staff, their averted eyes and quiet greetings, another layer of her isolation. In the master suite, a space larger than her first apartment, she sank onto the silk-covered chaise lounge. She pulled out her laptop. Her hands didn't tremble. The heartbreak of the last few hours was crystallizing not into tears, but into a cold, hard resolve. Harrison was meticulous, almost pathologically so, in his business life. He believed in redundancy and backups, in having access to everything everywhere. To that end, they had a shared cloud server, where scans of all important documents were kept, from passports to corporate filings. He'd insisted she have access, a testament to their partnership. It was a detail he would come to regret. She typed in her password. The excuse was the crisis at work. She would find the board minutes or the deal documents related to this sudden emergency. A small vindictive part of her wanted to see if his excuse held even a shred of truth. She scrolled through the folders: MGC board resolutions, Geneva acquisition, personal finances. It was in the latter that she found it, a subfolder labeled discretionary accounts. Inside was a litany of Amex statements for a black card she didn't know existed. The charges were a roadmap of a secret life. dinners for two at Perse and Daniel on nights he was supposedly working late. A recurring charge for a private suite at the Carlisle Hotel. Jewelry purchases from Cartier and Harry Winston, pieces she had never seen. And then the anchor that dragged her entire world under a monthly wire transfer. A staggering $50,000 every month for the last 18 months. It was sent to a shell corporation, Orchid Holdings, LLC. A quick search of the shell corporation's public records was all it took. The registered agent was a high-powered law firm known for creating anonymous entities for the ultra-wealthy. But a deeper dive using property databases she still had access to from her architecture days linked Orchid Holdings, LLC, to a single asset, a penthouse apartment. Not just any penthouse. It was in the new ultra-exclusive One High Garden Tower, a needle of glass and steel piercing the Tribeca skyline. Her blood ran cold. One High Garden was the talk of the town, a building so exclusive that residents were rumored to have their own private elevators that opened directly into their apartments, ensuring complete anonymity. The perfect place to hide a secret. The final piece of the puzzle slotted into place with a sickening click. One of the Amex statements had a charge from a high-end floral boutique. Audrey clicked on the digital receipt. A dozen long-stemmed white orchids, the flower she despised, finding them clinical and cold, sent to the One High Garden penthouse. The delivery name on the order, Sloane Harrison. Sloane. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She remembered her, now a junior analyst at a rival firm Harrison's company had acquired 2 years ago. Young, ambitious with sharp eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. Harrison had mentioned her once, praising her aggressive instincts. It seemed those instincts weren't limited to the trading floor. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. It was Harrison. She stared at it, the screen illuminating his handsome, smiling face from their last trip to St. Bart's. She let it go to voicemail. A moment later, a text appeared. Just seeing this. Voice message left. Call me back. This deal is a monster. I feel terrible, Audrey. I'll make it up to you, I promise. The lie was so bald, so insulting, it didn't even sting. It clarified. He wasn't just cheating. He was building a parallel life funded by their joint future, while she was at home building a nursery. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. The penthouse, the monthly stipend that amounted to more than most people's annual salaries. The shared name. It was a grotesque parody of the life he had with her. Audrey stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The man she had married did not exist. In his place was a stranger, a man who could leave his pregnant wife in a doctor's office to be with another woman, and then lie about it with the casual ease of ordering a coffee. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. But beneath it, a different feeling was taking root. It wasn't sadness. It was rage, a pure, undiluted fury that burned away the fog of grief. He had mistaken her quiet nature for weakness. He had mistaken her love for unconditional acceptance. He was about to learn that an architect knows more than just how to build. She also knows exactly where the load-bearing walls are and what it takes to bring the whole structure crashing down. The first call she made wasn't to him. It was to the most feared divorce attorney in New York City. Beatrice Shaw's office was the antithesis of Harrison's world. There was no polished chrome or abstract art. It was old money, old power. Walls lined with leather-bound legal books, a faint scent of paper and Earl Grey tea in the air, and a mahogany desk that looked like it had witnessed a century of New York's most scandalous secrets. Beatrice herself was in her late 60s, with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a reputation for dismantling powerful men with surgical precision. He didn't show up to the ultrasound. Audrey said, her voice steady. She had refused the tea and sat ramrod straight in the client chair. He claimed it was a business emergency. Beatrice listened without interruption, her fingers steepled. She didn't offer platitudes or condolences. She listened for facts, for leverage. Audrey laid it all out, the separate black card, the shell corporation, Orchid Holdings, LLC, the $50,000 monthly payments, the one Highgarden penthouse, and the name Sloane Harrison. She had printed everything, organizing it into a neat folder that she now pushed across the desk. Beatrice opened the folder and reviewed the documents. Her expression remained impassive, but Audrey saw a flicker of something in her eyes, the keen interest of a predator catching a scent. 18 months, Beatrice murmured, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the wire transfer statement. This isn't a fling, Mrs. Montgomery. This is a shadow family. The stipend, the dedicated residence. He's established her. In legal terms, this is what we call flaunted and notorious. Good for our purposes. What are my purposes? Audrey asked the question hanging in the quiet room. That depends, Beatrice replied, leaning back. What do you want? Do you want to burn him to the ground? Do you want to teach him a lesson and reconcile? Or do you want to quietly and cleanly sever this marriage, taking everything you are entitled to? And then some Audrey thought of the empty seat in the ultrasound room. She thought of the casual, insulting lie in his text message. She thought of her abandoned career, the years dedicated to his comfort, his image. I want to be free of him, she said, the words feeling more true than anything she'd said in years. But I will not be the one who walks away with nothing but scars. He built an empire on lies. I want to make sure my child and I are secure no matter what happens to him or his company. And I want him to understand what he has lost. Beatrice nodded slowly. Security is paramount. Revenge is a bonus, but it can cloud judgment. We will focus on the former, and in doing so we will likely achieve the latter. The first rule is silence. You do not confront him. You do not cry. You do not give him any indication that you know. From this moment on, you are the loving, supportive, slightly naive wife. Can you do that, Audrey, who had spent the last 5 years playing a part? Nodded. I can. Good, Beatrice said. Because while you play your part, we will be working in the background. My team will do a full asset search. Not just the declared assets, but the hidden ones. The offshore accounts, the private equity holdings disguised as company investments. Men like your husband, men with this level of arrogance, they always have secrets beyond the affair. The affair is just the loose thread. We pull on it, and his entire tapestry of deceit will unravel. Beatrice explained the strategy. They would hire a forensic accounting team, the best in the business. They would also engage a private investigator, not just to document Harrison's comings and goings with Sloane, but to dig into Sloane herself. Who is she? Beatrice mused, looking at the name on the floral receipt. Is she just a young opportunist, or is she something more? A 20-something analyst doesn't just land a millionaire and a $50,000 a month stipend without a certain skill set. We need to know what leverage she has on him, if any. Over the next few days, Audrey lived in a state of suspended reality. She returned Harrison's call, feigning sleepy disappointment. Oh, honey, I was so sad you weren't there. But I understand. I hope you closed the deal. We're still in the thick of it. He'd lied, his voice smooth and convincing. It's a real beast. I saw your message. Is everything okay? With the baby? Everything is perfect, she said, the word a shard of glass in her throat. A strong heartbeat. I have a picture for you when you get home. That night, he came home late, carrying a ridiculously large bouquet of peonies, her favorite. He was playing the part of the contrite husband, kissing her forehead, placing a hand on her still flat stomach, his eyes full of what she now recognized as manufactured sincerity. I'm so sorry, Audrey. I promise I will never miss another appointment, he'd said. She smiled and handed him the ultrasound photo. He looked at it, his face a mask of paternal awe. Incredible, he whispered. It was a masterful performance. 2 hours earlier, the private investigator Beatrice had hired a discreet man named Peterson, had sent her a photo. It was of Harrison and Sloane laughing as they left a restaurant in Tribeca, just a few blocks from her penthouse. While Harrison slept, Audrey was awake, communicating with her team. The forensic accountants were already finding discrepancies. Millions of dollars funneled from Montgomery Global into a series of shell companies, far beyond what was needed for Sloane's upkeep. It hinted at a much larger problem. Was he hiding money from the company's investors, or from her in anticipation of a divorce? Peterson, the PI, was also proving his worth. He'd discovered Sloane Harrison wasn't her real name. She was born Sabrina Hatcher from a working-class town in Ohio. She had legally changed her name 6 months after the acquisition of her firm by Montgomery Global. It was a calculated predatory move. She hadn't just fallen into an affair. She had rebranded herself to become his mistress. Peterson also had a source inside the One High Garden building, a disgruntled doorman who confirmed Harrison Montgomery was a frequent, almost daily visitor. He never used the front entrance, always the private garage, taking the service elevator to the sub-level, and then a private lift directly to the penthouse. A ghost in the building. The plan was solidifying. Beatrice wanted to wait to gather an irrefutable mountain of evidence before making a move. They would have proof of financial fraud, which would give them immense leverage in the divorce settlement. The infidelity was the moral wound. The financial crimes were the legal kill shot. Audrey played her part to perfection. She discussed nursery colors with Harrison. She let him rest his head on her lap while he complained about the stress of his deal. She felt nothing. It was like watching a movie of her own life. Inside, she was a different person. She was a CEO of a one-person corporation whose sole mission was the systematic dismantling of Harrison Montgomery. She was an architect, and she was drafting the blueprints of his ruin. The foundation was laid. The demolition was scheduled. All she had to do was wait for the right moment to press the detonator. The night it all shattered began just like any other night in their gilded cage. It was exactly 1 week after the missed ultrasound. Harrison was on the phone, pacing the length of their enormous living room. The city lights a glittering tapestry behind him. He was using his boardroom voice, a low, urgent tone that conveyed immense pressure and importance. "No, Arthur, you don't seem to understand." He snapped into his phone. "This isn't a negotiation. The exposure is untenable. Liquidate the position by morning. I don't care what the loss is. Contain it. Do you understand me? Contain it." He hung up and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. His shoulders tense. He looked over at Audrey, who was curled on the sofa pretending to read a book on prenatal nutrition. Everything all right, honey? She asked, her voice the perfect blend of concern and deference. Just a fire at work, he said, waving a dismissive hand. A fund in Singapore went sideways. Nothing I can't handle. He forced a smile. How are my two favorite people doing? He walked over and kissed her, his hand resting on her stomach. The gesture which once would have made her melt now felt like a violation. She had to fight the urge to flinch. Peterson's report from that afternoon was open on her tablet, hidden beneath the e-book. It contained photos of Harrison and Sloane, leaving a spa looking relaxed and intimate. The fire at work was a world away. "We're fine," she said, smiling back. "Just relaxing." He told her he needed to run to the office to personally oversee the crisis in the Singapore fund. It was another lie so routine now it was almost boring. She knew from Peterson that Sloane had a reservation at a new, impossible-to-get-into speakeasy downtown. "Of course, darling. Don't work too late," she said, kissing his cheek. "Be safe." The moment the door closed behind him, Audrey's facade dropped. She picked up her tablet and tracked his car, a black Escalade, not heading towards his mid-town office, but straight downtown towards Tribeca, towards One High Garden. A wave of cold fury washed over her, but it was familiar now, a companion. Beatrice's voice echoed in her head. Silence. Wait. Let him incriminate himself further. She settled in for the wait, a silent vigil in her silent house. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, the warmth of the mug doing little to soothe the ice in her veins. She communicated with Peterson via a secure messaging app. "Audrey. He's on his way to you. Said he was going to the office. Peterson confirmed. Escalade just pulled into the private garage at One High Garden. He's on the move." For the next 2 hours, Audrey sat in the deepening twilight, the book forgotten in her lap. She imagined them up there in the penthouse she was paying for with her future. Were they laughing at her? Did Sloane ask about the baby? The thought was a fresh stab of pain. This was the hardest part of the plan. The waiting, the knowing, the powerlessness of it all. And then something unexpected happened. Her secure phone buzzed. It was Peterson. "Peterson. Something's happening. This is not on the itinerary. Audrey." "What is it?" "Peterson security is converging on the penthouse level, not hotel security. These guys look like professionals. Black suits, earpieces. Very serious. Audrey." "Whose men?" "Not yours." "Peterson. Absolutely not." "I'm watching from my post across the street. There are 2 men at the service elevator and 2 more at her private entrance. They just let a man in a suit carrying a briefcase into the lobby. He's going up." Audrey's heart started to pound. This wasn't part of the plan. Beatrice's strategy was one of quiet intelligence gathering, not overt action. Who would be sending a team of men to Sloane's apartment? Peterson stand by. "The doorman is lighting up my phone. He says the man with the briefcase is a lawyer. He's serving an immediate eviction notice, and he has movers with him. They're on standby in the loading bay." Audrey stared at the message, her mind racing. An eviction. Tonight. But why? And who had ordered it? It couldn't be her. She and Beatrice had explicitly decided against any action that could tip Harrison off. Audrey. Whose lawyer? On what grounds? Peterson. The eviction is for breach of contract. The doorman said the lease is held by Orchid Holdings, LLC. The lawyer is from the firm that represents Montgomery Global. The world tilted. Harrison's lawyer. Harrison was evicting his own mistress. Peterson. She's coming out. They're escorting her out. She's yelling. Can't make out what she's saying. She has nothing with her but her purse. They are not letting her back in. The movers are going up now. They're boxing up the entire apartment. A picture came through a moment later. It was Sloane standing on the curb under the harsh streetlights, looking frantic and furious. Her perfect hair was disheveled, and she was screaming into her phone. A black car, not Harrison's, pulled up, and two of the men in suits flanked her, gesturing for her to get in. She refused, throwing her phone onto the pavement where it shattered. One of the men picked her up, not violently, but with an unnerving efficiency, and deposited her into the back of the car before it sped off into the night. Audrey felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. What was happening? This was Harrison's play. But it made no sense. Why would he detonate his own secret life tonight of all nights, the night he'd skipped their ultrasound? Was this some bizarre, twisted attempt to fix things, to get rid of the evidence and come crawling back to her? The timing was too specific, too brutal. He had left his pregnant wife, gone to his mistress, and then had her forcibly thrown out onto the street. This wasn't remorse. This was damage control. But the damage he was controlling for seemed far greater than just an affair. An hour later, the front door opened. Harrison walked in looking pale and shaken. He had loosened his tie, and his face was etched with a deep exhaustion that for the first time looked genuine. He saw her on the sofa, and his composure cracked for a second. He looked like a man who had just walked away from a car crash. "Audrey," he said, his voice raspy. "You're still up." "I was worried," she said, and for once it was the truth. She was worried, but not for him. She was worried because the game had changed. The board had been flipped, and she no longer understood the rules. He sank down beside her, burying his face in his hands. "It's been the night from hell." "The Singapore fund?" she asked, testing him. He looked up, his eyes haunted. "Yes. And other things. Complications." He took her hands, his grip cold and tight. "Audrey, there's something I have to tell you. I haven't been honest with you about the pressure I've been under. About everything." She braced herself. Was this it? The confession. The tearful admission of the affair, edited for his own absolution, now that the evidence had been conveniently disposed of. "I've made some mistakes," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Mistakes that have put this family at risk. I've been reckless." Audrey waited her silence a blank canvas onto which he could paint his lies. But as he spoke, she realized this wasn't about the affair. It was about something much bigger, and the eviction of Sloane Harrison wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosive beginning of a new, more dangerous one. "I had an affair." The words, when they finally came, landed in the quiet room with all the force of a controlled demolition. Harrison delivered them with his head bowed, his voice a carefully modulated whisper of shame. He was performing contrition, but Audrey, armed with the knowledge of the evening's brutal events, saw it for what it was, a calculated gambit. He was trying to get ahead of the story, to frame the narrative in a way that made him a flawed man, who'd made a terrible mistake rather than a sociopath who had just had his mistress professionally erased from her life. Audrey remained silent, letting him fill the void. This was Beatrice's core instruction. Let him talk. Liars will always reveal more than they intend. It was with a woman from work. He continued, still not looking at her. "It's over. It was a mistake, a symptom of the stress I've been under. It meant nothing, Audrey. You and this baby. You are my life." He finally risked a glance at her, his eyes pleading. He was expecting tears, recriminations, perhaps even a slap. He was prepared for a domestic drama. He was not prepared for her response. "Her name is Sloane Harrison," Audrey said, her voice devoid of emotion. Or rather, Sabrina Hatcher from Dayton, Ohio. "The penthouse at One High Garden, which you leased through Orchid Holdings, LLC, must have been lovely. Was the $50,000 a month stipend enough for her? Or did the Cartier shopping sprees come out of a different slush fund?" Harrison recoiled, as if she had physically struck him. The color drained from his face, leaving a pasty gray pallor. The mask of the penitent husband fell away, revealing the raw shock of a master manipulator who had just been checkmated. "How?" He stammered, his voice barely audible. "You're a brilliant man, Harrison," she said, standing up and walking to the bar to pour herself a glass of water. Her hand was perfectly steady. "But your arrogance is a fatal flaw. You assumed I was just the supportive wife tending to the home fires. You forgot I'm an architect. I see the blueprint. I see the rot in the foundation." He stared at her, speechless. He was off balance, his carefully rehearsed confession rendered useless. Audrey pressed her advantage. "So let's stop playing games," she said, turning to face him. "You didn't end things with Sloane tonight out of a sudden attack of conscience an hour after leaving her spa day. You had her evicted. Forcibly. I know you sent your corporate lawyers. I know you had a team of security remove her. So tell me, Harrison. Why? Why the scorched earth tactic? What are you so afraid of that you had to silence her in the most dramatic way possible? Cornered and exposed, Harrison's demeanor shifted. The shock gave way to a desperate, pragmatic fear. He got up and began to pace the hunter, now caged. "You don't understand," he said, running his hands through his hair. "It wasn't just an affair. It was complicated. Complicated for me, Audrey," demanded her voice like ice. He finally stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes wild with a panic that went far beyond infidelity. She was blackmailing me. Audrey felt a jolt, but her expression remained unchanged. This was the twist she had been waiting for, the reason for the night's bizarre events. "Blackmailing you over what?" The affair, she asked, knowing the answer was no. The affair was his leverage against her, not the other way around. He shook his head, letting out a harsh, bitter laugh. "God, I wish. No, not about the affair. About the company." He collapsed onto the sofa, the fight gone out of him. "Montgomery Global is in trouble, Audrey. Serious trouble. For the last 2 years, we've been hiding losses from a series of catastrophic investments in Asia. I cooked the books. We created off-balance sheet entities to hide the debt and inflate our earnings reports. It was supposed to be a temporary fix, a way to ride out the storm without spooking the investors and the board. The confession hung in the air, thick and toxic. This was the secret the forensic accountants had been sniffing around financial fraud on a massive scale. And Sloane Audrey prompted. She knew, Harrison whispered. When we acquired her firm, she was a junior analyst, but she's brilliant. Ruthless. She figured it out. She pieced together the transfers, the shell companies. She didn't confront me to expose me. She confronted me to profit from it. The affair, it was her way in. She became my confidant, my secret keeper. The penthouse, the money, it was all hush money. It was the price of her silence. Audrey finally understood the perverse logic. Sloane hadn't been a simple mistress. She had been a co-conspirator, a parasite who had attached herself to Harrison's sinking ship, intent on gorging herself before it went under. "So what happened tonight?" Audrey asked. "The whole thing is about to collapse," he said, his voice cracking. "A federal audit is imminent. Someone from inside must have tipped them off. I couldn't risk Sloane being subpoenaed. I couldn't risk her cutting a deal with the SEC to save herself. She had copies of documents, server logs, proof of everything. I had to get them back. The eviction wasn't just about removing her. It was a pretext to get my security team inside that apartment to retrieve every piece of data she had. We have her laptop, her phones, her hard drives." He looked at Audrey, his expression a desperate plea for an alliance. "I did it to protect us, Audrey. To protect this family. Everything I have, everything we have, is tied up in Montgomery Global. If it goes down, we lose everything. The houses, the money, the foundation, all of it. I know what I did was unforgivable. But I was trying to save our future. It was a masterful pivot. He was attempting to reframe his monstrous actions, the lies, the cheating, the fraud, as the misguided efforts of a family man trying to protect his legacy. He was trying to make her a co-conspirator in his cover-up, binding her to him through mutual interest in his survival. For a moment, a flicker of the old Audrey, the woman who loved him, felt a pang of pity for the broken man in front of her. He looked so defeated, so utterly destroyed. But then she remembered the cold ultrasound room. She remembered the pity in the technician's eyes. She remembered the chillingly efficient way Sloane had been disposed of, like human garbage. Harrison wasn't trying to save their family. He was trying to save himself. He had sacrificed Sloane to the fire, and now he was asking Audrey to help him rebuild his kingdom on her ashes. She looked at him, the man she once promised to love in sickness and in health, and felt nothing but contempt. He hadn't just underestimated her intelligence. He had fundamentally misunderstood her character. "You didn't do this for us, Harrison," she said, her voice quiet, but ringing with finality. "You did this for you. And you have no idea the trouble you're really in." Harrison stared at her confusion, clouding his desperate features. "What are you talking about?" "I told you everything. The danger is the federal audit. The danger was Sloane." "The danger, Harrison, is that you are a fool," Audrey replied. She walked over to the bookshelf, which appeared to be nothing more than a beautifully curated collection of art books and first editions. She pressed a discreet button, and a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a small hidden safe. She entered a code and removed a slim black hard drive. She held it up. "You seem to be under the impression that your team was successful tonight, that you retrieved all the evidence from Sloane's apartment." A new, more profound dread dawned on Harrison's face. "What is that?" "This," Audrey said, "is a complete mirror-imaged copy of every file Sloane Harrison had on you and Montgomery Global, and more." The blood drained from Harrison's face. He looked at the hard drive as if it were a venomous snake. "That's impossible. How my investigator, Mr. Peterson, is a very resourceful man," Audrey explained calmly. "While your goons were playing Secret Service and manhandling Sloane onto the street, he was having a very productive conversation with her. Turns out, being publicly humiliated and tossed aside by your millionaire benefactor makes you very eager to talk, especially when a calm, professional man offers you a secure car, a burner phone, and a direct line. To a lawyer who doesn't work for the man who just ruined you." She let the reality of his strategic blunder sink in. He had focused so intently on seizing Sloane's physical hardware that he never considered the most obvious contingency a cloud backup. Sloane is no fool either, Audrey continued. She knew you'd turn on her eventually. She had a dead man's switch, a constantly updated encrypted backup of all her files stored on a secure offshore server. The moment she was detained tonight, she sent a one-word text to a trusted third party. Go. That single word gave Mr. Peterson's cybersecurity contact the password to access and download everything. Audrey placed the hard drive on the marble coffee table between them. It sat there small and innocuous, containing the power to obliterate his entire world. So while you were busy shredding documents and congratulating yourself on your brilliant damage control, my attorney was receiving a treasure trove of evidence. Evidence of your affair, which establishes motive. Evidence of the monthly payments, which establishes a pattern. And the crown jewels, irrefutable proof of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Enough to send you to federal prison for a very, very long time. Harrison looked as though he couldn't breathe. The carefully constructed walls of his reality were not just cracking. They had been pulverized. He had been playing checkers while she was playing three-dimensional chess. Why, Audrey? He finally whispered, his voice broken. Why would you do this to destroy me, to destroy the father of your child? A bitter, humorless smile touched Audrey's lips. Destroy you, no. You did that halt all on your own. I'm doing what you claimed to be doing. I am protecting my family. My family, which consists of me and this baby. She walked back to the hidden safe and removed a thick, leather-bound folder. She placed it on the coffee table next to the hard drive. This is a post-nuptial agreement drafted by my attorney, Beatrice Shaw. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. It supersedes our original prenuptial agreement, citing your gross misconduct and criminal activities as grounds for a complete renegotiation. She opened the folder. Here are the terms. They are not negotiable. The townhouse is to be transferred into a trust for our child, with me as the sole trustee. A second trust will be established also for our child, funded with $150 million in liquid assets. This money must be clean, transferred from accounts that my forensic accountants have already vetted and cleared of any connection to your fraudulent activities. Luckily for you, your personal investment portfolio, the one you started before this mess, is substantial enough to cover it. She paused, letting him absorb the sheer scale of her demands. You will cede full sole legal and physical custody of our child to me. Your name will be on the birth certificate, but your parental rights will be terminated. You will have no say in their upbringing, their education, or their life. You will become a biological fact, not a father. Finally, she said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. You will sign this confession. It details the extent of the fraud at Montgomery Global. It names your co-conspirators. It is a full accounting of your crimes. Harrison stared at her in utter disbelief. You want me to sign my own death warrant? They'll crucify me. Why would I ever agree to this? Because of what I'm going to do with this hard drive, Audrey said, tapping the black plastic casing. If you sign everything, the postnup, the custody agreement, the trusts, the confession, by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, then this hard drive and my copy of the confession will be delivered by courier to the U.S. Attorney's office. They will prosecute you with a case gift-wrapped by your wife. You'll likely get a reduced sentence for your cooperation. You might even be out in 10 years. She leaned in her eyes, locking onto his. However, if you refuse to sign, if you fight me in any way, then this hard drive will be anonymously leaked to the Wall Street Journal, the SEC, and every major investor in Montgomery Global. The stock will hit 0 before the opening bell. Your partners will be ruined. The government will still come for you, but they won't be in a mood to offer you a deal, and you will have class action lawsuits from every shareholder you've defrauded. You will be buried so deep in litigation, you'll never see the light of day again. And you will have lost the single most valuable thing you could have possibly salvaged from this wreckage, a clean future for your child. It was checkmate. He had two options, and both led to his ruin. But one path offered a future for the Montgomery name and fortune, firewalled away from his crimes in the hands of his child. The other was a scorched earth apocalypse from which nothing would survive. Tears welled in Harrison's eyes, not of remorse, but of utter, absolute defeat. The titan of industry, the master of the universe, was broken. He looked from the hard drive to the folder, and then at the cool, implacable face of the woman he had betrayed. The woman who had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. Slowly, his hand trembling, he reached for the pen that Audrey had so thoughtfully placed on top of the folder. He was no longer the Harrison Montgomery, who commanded boardrooms and built empires. He was just a man signing away his life, brought down not by a federal agency or a corporate rival, but by the wife he had so grievously underestimated. The architect had finished her work. The demolition was complete. The silence that followed Harrison's capitulation was heavier than any argument ever had been. The only sound in the vast living room was the scratch of a Mont Blanc pen against thick, watermarked paper. Harrison sat hunched over the coffee table, a king signing away his kingdom under the unflinching gaze of his queen. He didn't read the documents. His lawyer, Arthur Finch, had been summoned and had arrived looking pale and funereal. He'd read them, his face growing grimmer with each clause, but he could offer no counsel. The situation was absolute. There was no loophole, no counteroffer, no strategy left to deploy. There was only the hard drive on the table and the abyss it represented. Audrey stood by the window, her back to him, watching the first hint of dawn streak the sky in shades of grey and bruised violet. She did not watch him sign. It was not a moment of triumph she needed to savour, but a grim necessity. The final messy task of demolition before reconstruction could begin. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were a project manager, overseeing a complex transaction rather than a wife dismantling her own life. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind a clear, cold, and quiet space. One by one, he signed the post-nuptial agreement, the irrevocable trust documents for their child, the transfer of the deed to the townhouse, the termination of his parental rights. Finally, the confession. When he pushed the last paper away, the pen fell from his trembling fingers and rolled onto the expensive rug, a final small surrender. Arthur Finch, his face a mask of professional duty, gathered the documents, his movements stiff. "Audrey," he said, "avoiding the title of Mrs. Montgomery, everything appears to be in order. The wire transfers for the trust will be initiated by my office at 8 a.m. They will be completed by noon." "Thank you, Arthur," Audrey said, turning to face them. Her gaze fell on Harrison. He looked hollowed out, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. The charisma and power that had once electrified rooms were gone, replaced by the vacant stare of a man who had lost his future. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice a rasp. It wasn't a question of negotiation, but the plea of a condemned man asking if the execution was over. "Your personal effects," Audrey said, her tone level. "The staff have been instructed to pack your closets. They will be delivered to a location of your choosing. You have 1 hour." She did not want a protracted, painful departure. She wanted a clean cut. He nodded numbly, then rose to his feet and walked not toward the grand staircase to their master suite, but towards the door. "I won't need anything," he said without turning around. "There's nothing here for me." He walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. The sound echoed the finality of a coffin lid shutting. Audrey stood alone in the center of her reclaimed territory, the silence her first taste of freedom. By mid-morning, Beatrice Shaw arrived. She swept into the townhouse, her practical leather briefcase a stark contrast to the opulence around her. She found Audrey not in the formal living room, but in the sun-filled space designated to become the nursery sketching on a large pad of paper. Beatrice reviewed the signed documents and the confirmation of the wire transfers from Arthur Finch's office. She gave a single, satisfied nod. "It's done," she said. "Clean, irrevocable. The assets are secured in trust, untouchable by him, his creditors, or the United States government. Your child's future is guaranteed." "And?" Harrison Audrey asked, shading in the outline of a window seat on her sketch. "He confessed to his board this morning. The fallout is biblical. The stock is halted. The SEC has formally launched its investigation, and several board members have already retained criminal counsel. He used your copy of his confession to get ahead of the leak. He's trying to control the narrative of his own downfall. It won't save him, but it might reduce his sentence as you predicted." "Good," Audrey said simply. It wasn't said with malice, but with a sense of closure. His fate was his own making. There was one last piece of business. "What about Sloane Hatcher?" Audrey asked, looking up from her drawing. Beatrice's expression was shrewd. "She's in a hotel under a new name, paid for by my office. She's shaken, but she's a survivor. She's already asked about a deal in exchange for her testimony." "What do you want to do with her?" Audrey thought for a moment. She could let Sloane be consumed by the federal investigation, another piece of collateral damage in Harrison's war. Or she could do something else. Harrison's method was to use people and discard them. She would not be him. "She has nothing more to offer us," Audrey said. "The hard drive gave us all the leverage we needed. But she was a catalyst. In a way, her greed and ambition handed me the keys to my own freedom." She looked at Beatrice. "Arrange a settlement for her, enough to start a new life somewhere far from New York. Have her sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. I don't want to hear the names Sabrina Hatcher or Sloane Harrison ever again. Let her disappear." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. It was a move of supreme power, not revenge, but dismissal. Audrey wasn't just winning the war. She was rewriting the terms of peace for everyone involved, demonstrating a capacity for pragmatic mercy Harrison never possessed. "Consider it done," Beatrice said. "Audrey, you've handled this with a fortitude I rarely see. What will you do now?" Audrey looked around the empty room, her hand resting on her stomach where the faintest swell was beginning to show. "For 5 years I was Mrs. Montgomery. I designed homes for him. I curated a life for him. Now, I think I'll get back to my own work, starting with this room." After Beatrice left, Audrey walked through the cavernous townhouse. It was no longer a cage, but a canvas. The ghosts of her old life were already fading. The staff, who had served Harrison with fearful deference, now looked at her with a quiet, profound respect. She was not just the lady of the house. She was its foundation. Later that afternoon, she had another ultrasound appointment. This time, she didn't go alone. Her best friend, Penelope Grant, a sharp-witted gallery owner she had known since college, was by her side, her hand squeezing Audrey's reassuringly. In the now familiar room, which no longer felt cold, Audrey watched the screen. And there it was, a tiny flickering heartbeat. Strong, persistent, a life separate from all the chaos and deceit, a promise of a future she would build herself. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of grief or rage. They were tears of profound, overwhelming love and relief. As she and Penelope left the clinic, the city sunlight felt warm on her face. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Harrison Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Global, resigns amidst massive fraud scandal. She glanced at it, then deleted the notification without a second thought. That was a story from another lifetime. Her story was just beginning. She wasn't a Davenport by birth and a Montgomery by marriage anymore. She was building her own dynasty, a legacy of one, soon to be two. And it would be built not on lies and shifting foundations, but on unbreakable strength and the enduring promise of a new dawn. In the end, Audrey Davenport didn't just survive the wreckage of her marriage. She rose from it, stronger and more in command of her destiny than ever before. She walked away, not as a victim of a millionaire husband's betrayal, but as the architect of her own salvation. She proved that the deepest betrayals can sometimes forge the strongest resolve. Her story isn't just about a cheating husband and a secret penthouse. It's a testament to the power of a woman who, when pushed to the brink, refused to crumble, and instead chose to rebuild her world on her own terms, securing a safe and prosperous future for the one person who truly mattered, her child. What did you think of Audrey's incredible story of strength and strategy? Could you have played the long game like she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were captivated by this tale of drama and twists, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. The air in the mahogany-paneled office of Thorne & Associates was thick with the scent of old leather and fresh grief. But for Eleanor Sterling, it was thick only with humiliation. They said her husband, the real estate magnate, Richard Sterling, was worth over $900 million. For 25 years, she had been the perfect corporate wife, the silent partner, the elegant hostess. And now she sat listening to his last will and testament, a final love letter to his legacy, and a final brutal insult to her. The lawyer's voice was a monotone drone, but one phrase cut through the fog. And to my wife, Eleanor, I leave the sum of $10,000. A gasp rippled through the room. But what no one knew, not the sneering young fiancé, not the corporate lawyers, not even Eleanor herself, was that Richard's greatest trick wasn't in the millions he left behind, but in the billions he had hidden. And the key to it all was sitting right there in the one name he thought he could control forever hers. The Sterling penthouse on Park Avenue wasn't a home. It was a statement. It occupied the top 2 floors of a limestone monolith with floor-to-ceiling windows that didn't just overlook Central Park, they commanded it. Every surface was either Italian marble, polished chrome, or exotic wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil and money. This was the world Richard Sterling had built, and Eleanor Vance Sterling was its most prized and most neglected ornament. Their marriage 25 years ago had been a merger. He was the brash, ambitious developer, clawing his way up from a working-class background in Queens. She was the quiet cerebral art history graduate from a respectable, albeit not wealthy, Boston family. He saw her as class, a touch of old-world grace, to soften his ruthless edges. She, in her youthful naivete, had seen a diamond in the rough, a man of ferocious energy she mistook for passion. Over the years, the diamond had been polished, but it had also hardened. Richard became a titan of New York real estate. Sterling Tower, Sterling Plaza. The Sterling residences, his name was etched in steel and glass across the city skyline. And with every new acquisition, every billion-dollar deal, a piece of the man Eleanor had married, chipped away, replaced by an insatiable, cold ambition. Their life became a meticulously curated performance. Dinners were not for conversation, but for cementing deals. Vacations were not for relaxing, but for networking in St. Bart's or Monaco. Eleanor played her part flawlessly. She remembered the names of board members' wives, knew which charities to support for maximum social impact, and could host a gala for 500 people without a single flower being out of place. But in the quiet moments, the silence in their cavernous apartment was deafening. Richard rarely spoke to her about his business anymore. In the early days, he would spread blueprints across the dining table, his eyes alight with excitement. Now business was conducted in hushed phone calls behind the closed door of his study. When she asked, he would pat her hand condescendingly. "Don't you worry your pretty head about it, Ellie. Just tell me the caterer for the fundraiser is the best." He controlled everything. Her credit card statements were reviewed by his accountant. The driver reported her destinations. He even suggested her friends, subtly phasing out anyone he deemed too independent or inquisitive. Eleanor, a woman who could once debate the nuances of Renaissance art for hours, found her world shrinking until it was contained within the gilded walls of their penthouse. The final crack in their pristine facade arrived in the form of Amber Croft. She was 28, with a law degree she barely used, and an ambition that rivaled Richard's own. He hired her as a special consultant for his international acquisitions. Soon she was everywhere. At his side in board meetings, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes at dinner parties, her hand lingering on his arm a fraction too long. She looked at Richard with a rapacious hunger that he mistook for adoration. She saw a king, and she wanted the crown. Eleanor saw it all. She saw the way Richard's chest puffed out when Amber praised him. She saw the secret shared smiles across a crowded room. She wasn't angry, not anymore. The part of her that could feel that fiery betrayal had been numbed by years of quiet neglect. What she felt was a profound, weary sadness. The end came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. It was a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was arranging flowers in the foyer when Richard emerged from his study, impeccably dressed in a Tom Ford suit. "Eleanor," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We need to talk." They sat in the formal living room, a space so perfect it looked like no one had ever lived in it. "I've instructed my lawyer, Marcus Thorne, to draw up divorce papers," he stated, as if discussing a quarterly report. "I think it's for the best. We've grown apart." Eleanor simply stared at him. "Grown apart? Or have you simply found a newer model, Richard?" A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He hated being so transparent. "Amber is a dynamic and brilliant woman. She understands my world." The implication hung heavy in the air. "You do not." "I see," she said, her voice a quiet whisper. "I'll be generous, of course," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "You'll be very comfortable. We'll release a joint statement about amicable differences. It's all been handled." He stood up, adjusting his tie. He looked at his Patek Philippe watch. "I have a meeting. Marcus will be in touch with your lawyer. Just be sensible about this, Ellie." And with that, He walked out of the room, out of the apartment, and out of her life. Eleanor sat there for a long time, the scent of the white lilies she was arranging suddenly cloying and funereal. He hadn't just ended their marriage. He had liquidated it. Richard Sterling did not do things by halves. His divorce from Eleanor was as public and brutal as his corporate takeovers. His PR team painted a narrative for the tabloids, the dynamic, forward-looking billionaire held back by a staid, old-fashioned wife. They leaked photos of him and a radiant Amber Croft on a yacht in the Mediterranean, while anonymous sources whispered about Eleanor's unreasonable demands. Eleanor, guided by her lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Sarah Jenkins, remained silent. She wanted a quiet, dignified exit, but Richard wouldn't allow it. He fought her on every asset, claiming everything was a product of Sterling Properties, a corporate entity, not marital property. The Park Avenue penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the art collection she had so lovingly curated, he claimed it all. He offered her a settlement that was in the context of his vast wealth, a pittance. It was enough to live comfortably, but it was designed to be a public slap in the face. Sarah Jenkins fought valiantly, but Richard's legal team, led by the formidable Marcus Thorne, was an army. They buried them in paperwork, delayed hearings, and bled Eleanor's resources dry. Then, just 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the unthinkable happened. Richard Sterling, a man who seemed too powerful and vital to ever succumb to mortal weakness, had a massive heart attack on his private jet while flying back from Dubai with Amber. He was dead at 62. The news was a global phenomenon. Financial markets fluttered. Tributes poured in from world leaders and business moguls. And Eleanor, who was now living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, felt a confusing mix of shock and a strange, hollow relief. The fight was over. The reading of the will was scheduled 2 weeks later. Eleanor almost didn't go. "What's the point, Sarah?" she asked her lawyer over the phone. He made his feelings perfectly clear during the divorce. "You have to," Sarah insisted. "You were his wife for 25 years. You need to be there for your own closure to see the final chapter close. Don't let them erase you." So she went. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to Amber Croft, who was positioned next to Richard's older brother, looking every bit the grieving widow in a dramatic black veil and couture dress. The room was filled with Sterling Properties board members, distant family, and a few charity representatives. The air crackled with tension and whispered speculation. Marcus Thorne, his face a grim mask of professionalism, began to read. The will was a testament to Richard's ego. Millions were left to his alma mater, to museums that would name wings after him, and to various foundations that would carry the Sterling name into perpetuity. Generous but calculated bequests were made to his brother and a few loyal executives. Then came the main event. "To my beloved fiancée, Amber Croft." Thorne read his voice unwavering. "I bequeath the entirety of my controlling interest in Sterling Properties, its subsidiaries and all associated assets, including the penthouse apartment at 740 Park Avenue, the estate in Southampton, and my complete art collection." A collective, barely audible intake of breath swept the room. Amber, behind her veil, managed a delicate theatrical sob. She was now, for all intents and purposes, one of the wealthiest women in the world. Thorne cleared his throat and looked down at the final page. "And finally," he said, his eyes flicking towards Eleanor for a fraction of a second, "a personal addendum from Mrs. Sterling." He picked up a separate, smaller envelope and read from a single sheet of paper written in Richard's own aggressive scrawl. "And to my former wife, Eleanor Vance Sterling, who never understood the effort or the genius it took to build my empire, but who certainly enjoyed its comforts, I leave the sum of $10,000. May it help you to finally learn the value of a dollar." The silence that followed was more damning than any shout. It was a silence filled with pity, with scorn, with the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of the gesture. Eleanor felt every eye in the room on her. She saw the smirk Amber couldn't quite hide behind her veil. She felt the color drain from her own face, leaving a cold, numb sensation in its wake. $10,000. After 25 years of her life, that was his final valuation of her. She didn't storm out. She didn't cry. With a poise that she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor stood up, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Sarah, and walked out of the room. The clicks of her heels on the marble floor were the only sound, each one a hammer blow to her shattered pride. Her humiliation was now complete, witnessed and sealed by the last will and testament of the man she had once loved. The weeks following the will reading were a blur of grey. The story was, of course, leaked to the press. "Sterling's final rebuke: tycoon leaves ex-wife pennies," screamed one headline. Eleanor became a public object of pity, a cautionary tale whispered about at charity luncheons she no longer attended. Old friends, the society friends who had revolved around Richard's son, stopped calling. Their invitations were contingent on proximity to power, and Eleanor was now powerless. She moved out of the rental apartment she could no longer afford and found a small one-bedroom walk-up in Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens. It was a world away from Park Avenue. The floors creaked, the radiator hissed, and the view was of a brick wall. For the first month, she barely left. The $10,000 check sat on her kitchen counter. An object of such profound insult, she couldn't bring herself to cash it. Her world had been reduced to 4 small rooms. The woman who had managed a staff of 12 now struggled to figure out the temperamental washing machine in the building's basement. The woman who had dined at Le Bernardin now ate toast for dinner because she was too exhausted to cook. It was in this crucible of loneliness and anonymity that Eleanor Vance finally began to re-emerge from the shadow of Eleanor Sterling. One rainy afternoon, overwhelmed by the oppressive silence, she opened a box that had been in storage for years. Inside were her old college textbooks on art history. She ran her fingers over the faded covers, the smell of old paper and ink, a ghost from a life she had almost forgotten. She pulled out a book on the Dutch masters and began to read. It started as an escape, a way to fill the empty hours, but slowly it became something more. She reread her old essays, her notes scribbled in the margins. She remembered the passion she had felt, the thrill of deciphering the hidden symbolism in a Vermeer or the emotional turmoil in a Rembrandt. A part of her that had been dormant for a quarter of a century began to stir. She started visiting museums again, not as a patron for a gala, but as a student. She would spend hours in front of a single painting at the Met or the Frick collection, a notebook in hand, losing herself in the brush strokes. She was no longer Mrs. Sterling, a name that opened doors. She was just Eleanor Vance, an anonymous woman in a sensible coat, finding solace in the quiet, timeless beauty of art. One day she cashed the check, not out of defeat, but out of pragmatism. It paid for 3 months' rent and a new laptop. With the laptop, she started writing again. She started a small blog, Vance's Vision, where she wrote detailed essays on art exhibits, historical context, and artistic theory. Her writing was sharp, insightful, and deeply personal. It found a small but dedicated audience of art lovers and students. For the first time in years, She felt a sense of purpose that was entirely her own. It was during this time that Sarah Jenkins, her lawyer, called. "Eleanor, how are you holding up?" Sarah's voice was warm with genuine concern. "I'm okay, Sarah. I'm surviving," Eleanor replied, a hint of her old self returning. "I've been going over the divorce settlement paperwork again," Sarah said, her tone shifting to business. "And some of the corporate filings from over the years. There's something that's been bothering me." "What is it?" Eleanor asked, not with any hope, but with mild curiosity. "During your marriage, Richard had you sign dozens, maybe hundreds of documents. Spousal consent forms, power of attorney for specific transactions, things like that. You remember?" "Vaguely," Eleanor admitted. "He would just put a stack in front of me and say, 'Sign here, Ellie, it's for a bank loan,' or 'It's for a new property title.' I never read them. I trusted him." "I know. Most spouses in your position do," Sarah said. "But I've been looking at the names of the entities you were signing for. Most are standard subsidiaries of Sterling Properties. But there are a few outliers. Companies I can't find any public link to Sterling. One name in particular keeps cropping up over and over again for the last 15 years. A chill went down Eleanor's spine, an inexplicable sense of dread and premonition. "What's the name?" "It's a holding company," Sarah said, her voice slow and deliberate. "It's called Vance Holdings, Inc." Vance, her own maiden name. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness gripping the edge of her small kitchen table to steady herself. "Vance Holdings. I've never heard of it. I've never owned a company." "According to these documents, you do," Sarah said, the sound of rustling papers audible through the phone. "Or at least you are the sole listed director and signatory. Richard set it up 15 years ago. You signed the incorporation papers. You signed documents giving you signatory power over its bank accounts. You signed authorizations for dozens of transactions in its name." Eleanor's mind raced back through the years. She pictured Richard standing over her desk, a sheaf of papers in one hand, an expensive pen in the other. His impatient sigh. "It's just legal boilerplate, Ellie. For tax purposes. You know I handle all this." And she would sign her elegant signature flowing across the page, never once questioning, never once reading the fine print. The trust she'd had in him felt like a monumental, crushing stupidity. What? What kind of company is it, Sarah? That's the $1,000,000 question, or maybe the $1,000,000,000 one? Sarah replied, a new edge of excitement in her voice. On the surface, it's just a shell corporation, registered in Delaware. Minimal public records, but the transaction authorizations you signed, they aren't small. They are for the purchases of very specific, very high-value assets. A commercial building on Fifth Avenue, a portfolio of blue-chip stocks, a collection of impressionist paintings purchased at a private auction in Geneva. Eleanor sank into a chair. The Monet, the Degas. Richard told me a corporate partner bought those for the Sterling Properties collection. They weren't bought by Sterling Properties, Sarah said, her voice firm. They were bought by Vance Holdings. Eleanor, legally, they were bought by you. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal deep diving. Sarah hired a forensic accountant, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Peterson. Together in Sarah's small office, they began to piece together the puzzle. It was like chasing a ghost through a labyrinth of corporate law. Richard had been brilliant. Vance Holdings was just the beginning. It was the parent company for other smaller entities, all cleverly named to be innocuous. EV Investments, the Vance Trust. Each one was a separate legal entity, a firewalled container for a specific set of assets. They discovered a pattern. Sterling Properties, The public-facing empire Richard had left to Amber was a giant, but it was a giant encumbered with enormous debt leverage and complex financial obligations. It was the working part of his fortune, constantly in flux, vulnerable to market downturns and lawsuits. But the assets placed in the Vance-named companies were different. They were pristine, prime real estate with no mortgages, a stock portfolio worth hundreds of millions, completely unleveraged. Art and jewelry collections that were the envy of the world. These were his crown jewels, the solid, unshakable core of his wealth. He had systematically siphoned off the purest profits from his empire for over a decade and tucked them away into this shadow structure. It's a classic asset protection scheme, Peterson explained, pointing to a complex flowchart they had drawn on a whiteboard. He was terrified of a hostile takeover, a catastrophic lawsuit, or even government seizure. So he created a legally separate entity to hold his most valuable, clean assets. A lifeboat in case the main ship went down. "But why use my name?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why not an anonymous offshore account?" "Because that's the genius of it," Sarah chimed in, her eyes shining with a lawyer's admiration for a clever scheme. Offshore accounts attract suspicion. The IRS, the SEC, they look for those. But a domestic holding company, in the name of his wife, his quiet, non-business art historian wife. Nobody would ever look there. It was the perfect hiding place right out in the open. He put his fortune in the one place he was absolutely certain no one would ever think to check. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Richard hadn't just used her name. He had used his perception of her, her passivity, her lack of interest in his business world, her trust. He had weaponized his own underestimation of her. He had built a fortress for his wealth and made her the unwitting, invisible gatekeeper. The problem remained, however. They could see the outlines of the empire, but they didn't have the keys. The bank accounts were protected by layers of security. The deeds and stock certificates were held in secure vaults. They knew the what, but not the how. To claim it, they needed someone from the inside. They needed someone who knew Richard's system, his passwords, his private bankers. And there was only one man alive who fit that description, a man whose name alone made Eleanor's stomach clench. "We have to talk to Julian Croft," Sarah said, her expression grim. "Richard's financial advisor and Amber's uncle." The name Julian Croft landed like a stone in the pit of Eleanor's stomach. For 20 years, Julian had been Richard's most trusted advisor, a quiet, meticulous man who was the architect of Richard's financial strategies. He was also Amber's uncle, the one who had introduced her to Richard in the first place, hoping to secure her a cushy internship. The idea of approaching him felt like walking into a lion's den. "He'll never help us, Sarah," Eleanor protested. "He's her family. He helped Richard build this maze. Why would he help us dismantle it?" "Because he's a professional," Sarah countered. "His loyalty was to his client, Richard. Richard is gone. His new client is Amber, who just inherited a public company. His legal duty is to that company. Vance Holdings is a separate entity. And besides," Sarah added, leaning forward, "we have nothing to lose by asking. The worst he can say is no." Reluctantly, Eleanor agreed. Sarah made the call, framing it as a procedural inquiry regarding some outstanding paperwork from the divorce. Julian Croft, ever the professional, agreed to a meeting. They met not in a corporate boardroom, but in a quiet, old-fashioned coffee shop in Greenwich Village. Julian Croft was in his late 60s, with thinning grey hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and a somber suit that seemed to be his uniform. He looked more like a history professor than a high finance wizard. He listened patiently as Sarah laid out their findings, presenting him with copies of the documents Eleanor had signed, the incorporation papers for Vance Holdings, and the transaction records they had managed to uncover. Throughout her presentation, his face remained an impassive, unreadable mask. When Sarah finished, he took a slow sip of his black coffee. He placed the cup down carefully, his gaze shifting from the documents to Eleanor. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and she saw not hostility, but a deep, weary resignation. "I wondered when you might figure this out," he said, his voice a low baritone. "Or if you ever would." Eleanor and Sarah exchanged a stunned glance. "You knew," Eleanor whispered. "Mrs. Sterling." "Eleanor," he corrected himself. "I didn't just know. I helped him set it up. It was my idea initially. The asset protection strategy. It was standard practice for a man of his wealth and appetites." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Richard's weakness was his arrogance. He believed he could control everything and everyone. He created Vance Holdings as his ultimate safety net. He put it in your name because he believed you were the safest variable in his life. Predictable, uncurious, pliable. Each word was a confirmation of her deepest insecurities, yet coming from him it sounded less like an insult and more like a diagnosis. "Why are you telling us this?" Sarah asked, cutting to the chase. Julian Croft looked out the window for a long moment, watching the city rush by. "I have a niece," he began, his voice laced with a bitterness that surprised them both. "I watched her grow up. I saw the ambition in her, the same ruthless, empty ambition I saw in Richard. I introduced them thinking a man like Richard could temper her, give her direction. Instead, they amplified the worst in each other. He fed her greed, and she fed his ego." He turned back to them, his eyes filled with a profound disappointment. "I spent 20 years helping Richard Sterling build an empire. I watched him become a titan, and I watched him become a monster. I watched how he treated you, Eleanor. The quiet dismissals, the public slights. You carried yourself with a dignity he never deserved." He slid a single key and a small folded piece of paper across the table. "I have no love for what my niece has become. She has inherited a public persona, an over-leveraged company, and a mountain of headaches. That is Richard's legacy to her. But his real genius, his real fortune, he entrusted that to you even if he did it for all the wrong reasons." Eleanor looked down at the key. It was a simple brass key for a safe deposit box. On the paper was an address for a private vault in Midtown and a long string of numbers and letters. "What is this?" she asked. "That, Julian said, is the master ledger. Richard was meticulous. He kept a hard copy of every transaction, every account number, every password, every deed, every certificate related to the Vance entities. He kept it off-site, away from any server that could be hacked. That key and that code will give you access. It is the constitution of his secret kingdom." He stood up, placing a $20 bill on the table. "My professional obligation was to Richard Sterling. He is dead. My familial obligation is to a woman I no longer respect. But my moral obligation, I believe that lies here." He gave Eleanor a final, solemn nod. "He underestimated you, Eleanor. It was his greatest and his last mistake. I hope you use it to build something better than he ever could." And with that, Julian Croft walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Eleanor and Sarah staring at the small brass key that had the power to change everything. The journey to the private vault in Midtown felt like a descent into another world. Above on 47th Street, the city was a chaotic symphony of honking cabs, shouting vendors, and the frantic energy of commerce. But once they stepped through the unmarked bronze doors of Metropolitan Secure Storage, all sound vanished, replaced by a hushed, refrigerated silence. The air was cool and still smelling of polished steel and the kind of absolute security that money and only money can buy. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched the small brass key in her pocket, its serrated edges digging into her palm. Beside her, Sarah Jenkins was a picture of professional calm. Her briefcase held firmly in hand, but even she seemed to carry a new tension in her shoulders. They were acting on the word of an untrustworthy ally to chase a ghost through his final hiding place. A guard with the build of a linebacker and the expression of a statue led them through a series of security checkpoints. Fingerprint scans, retinal scans a password that Sarah read from her phone. Each step took them deeper into the facility's core. Finally, they stood before a wall of gleaming steel doors, a silent, intimidating grid of secrets. The guard pointed to a small drawer. 2 keys are required to open the box, ours and yours. He inserted a long, institutional-looking key into a lock. He then stepped back, indicating the second lock with a nod. With a trembling hand, Eleanor inserted the brass key Julian Croft had given her. It felt impossibly small, almost frivolous against the massive steel door. She turned it. A solid, satisfying thunk echoed in the silent chamber. The guard pulled the heavy door open, revealing a long, steel-lined box. "The private viewing room is down the hall," he said, his voice a monotone drone. Together, Eleanor and Sarah carried the box its weight, surprising and significant. It felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with the secrets of a man Eleanor had thought she knew. Inside the viewing room, a small, featureless space with a single steel table and 2 chairs, they set the box down. The silence was absolute. Eleanor's hands hesitated over the latch. "What do you think is in here, Sarah?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Gold bearer bonds. Things I can't even imagine." "I don't know." Sarah admitted, her lawyerly composure momentarily slipping. "But with Richard, I've learned to expect the meticulously organized and the monumentally arrogant." Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the box. There was no gleam of gold, no stacks of cash. Instead, there were 2 items. The first was a single thick leather-bound ledger, the color of dried blood. The second was a small encrypted hard drive. Eleanor ran a finger over the worn leather cover of the ledger. There was no title, no label, just the faint indentation of years of pressure from Richard's hand. It was the physical embodiment of his secret life. She opened it to the first page. There, in Richard's precise, aggressive handwriting, was the heading Vance Holdings, Inc., Asset Acquisitions. The first entry was dated 15 years ago. It detailed the cash purchase of a commercial building on Rodeo Drive for a price that made Eleanor gasp. Page after page, they saw it all. Meticulous entries detailing dates, prices, holding companies, and account numbers. A flowing chronological record of the secret siphoning of a fortune. They didn't speak for nearly an hour. The only sound, the soft rustle of the thick paper as Eleanor turned each page. She saw the purchase of the Monet she had so admired at a gala. The one Richard had breezily told her was a new acquisition for the corporate collection. Here in his own hand was the truth, purchased via the Vance Trust, transferred to Geneva Free Port Storage. She saw the stock purchases thousands of shares of blue-chip companies bought in her name through EV investments. She saw entries for cars, jewelry, even a private villa on Lake Como she never knew existed. It was an empire built in stealth, a financial masterpiece of concealment. And every transaction, every acquisition, was legally tied to her name. By the time they reached the final entry, dated just a week before Richard's death, the sheer scale of his deception had left them breathless. Back in Sarah's office, they plugged the encrypted hard drive into Peterson's secure laptop. Armed with the master password from the ledger's inside cover, the drive unlocked, revealing spreadsheets that mirrored the ledger's contents, but with updated real-time valuations. Peterson, the grizzled forensic accountant, let out a low whistle. "My God," he murmured, his fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing, verifying, and tallying. "This is a work of art. Look at this real estate portfolio. No leverage, no mortgages, just pure, unadulterated cash flow. And this stock portfolio. It's a dream. Not a single margin loan against it." He projected the main spreadsheet onto the large monitor on the wall. The numbers glowed in the dimming afternoon light. The neat columns and staggering figures represented the true essence of Richard Sterling. The public-facing company he had left to Amber was his war machine, loud, powerful, but heavily armed with debt and obligations. This hidden portfolio was his crown, silent, perfect, and untouchable. Finally, after another hour of intense work, Peterson leaned back, his face a mixture of professional awe and disbelief. "Okay," he said, his voice heavy. "I have a final conservative valuation." Eleanor and Sarah waited, their hands clasped on the table. "As we know," Peterson began, standing and walking to the monitor. "Sterling Properties, the company Ms. Croft inherited, has a net asset value of approximately $950 million once you factor in its colossal debt. It's a massive, complex, and high-risk entity." He pointed a laser at the spreadsheet on the wall. "These assets, however, the real estate, the stocks, the bonds, the art, the physical commodities all legally held under the Vance umbrella of companies, are the exact opposite. They are stable, unleveraged, and pure. And their combined current market value is—" He paused, letting the moment hang in the air. $2.8 billion. The figure 2,000 tons, 800,000 £1,000, seemed to suck the very air from the room. Eleanor felt a wave of vertigo gripping the table to steady herself. It wasn't joy or triumph she felt, but a profound, soul-crushing shock. "The will, the $10,000, she whispered, was the greatest head fake in history." Sarah finished for her, her voice tight with fury on Eleanor's behalf. "This was his ultimate plan, Eleanor. Don't you see, it wasn't enough to divorce you and humiliate you. He constructed this entire secret empire in your name, using the powers of attorney you signed, believing you'd never look. His plan was to finalize the divorce, cast you aside, and then at his own pace use those same documents to transfer all of this into a new trust for himself. He was going to steal your own fortune from you, and you never would have even known you had it." The full monstrous weight of his arrogance, of his breathtaking condescension, finally crashed down on Eleanor. He hadn't just hidden his fortune in her name. He had made her the unwitting temporary guardian of his true legacy. He saw her as nothing more than a secure, silent vault. And his only miscalculation, the one fatal flaw in his perfect, brilliant plan, was the simple, unpredictable fact of his own mortality. He had successfully moved every piece into place for the checkmate, but had died before he could declare it. And in doing so, he had left the board, the game, and the entire kingdom to the one player he had never even considered an opponent. The reckoning did not begin with a cannon blast, but with the quiet, relentless turning of legal gears. In Sarah Jenkins' office, the days that followed the discovery of the ledger were a blur of focused intensity. They were no longer searching for a ghost. They were methodically dismantling a fortress. Sarah Peterson and a small, hand-picked team of specialists worked with the precision of surgeons. Change of control notifications drafted with ironclad legal language and supported by notarized copies from the ledger were dispatched via secure courier to a dozen different financial institutions across the globe. Each document was a legal torpedo, silent and unseen, streaking toward the hull of Amber Croft's inherited empire. The first impact struck on a Tuesday. Amber was in a private viewing room at a NetJets facility, the scent of new leather and jet fuel intoxicating her. She had decided Sterling Properties needed a new G650. It was a statement, a way of announcing that the Queen was firmly on the throne. When the sales executive returned, his face was pale, his professional smile strained. "There appears to be an issue with the wire transfer, Ms. Croft," he stammered. "The funds from the Geneva account. They've been blocked." Amber laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Blocked? Don't be ridiculous. There are over $200 million in that account. Try again. Tell them who I am." "We have Ms. Croft," the executive said, sweating under his collar. "The bank was very clear. They said there is a new sole signatory on the account. An Eleanor Vance." The name hung in the air, a foul odor in the pristine room. Amber's smile vanished. Confusion, then fury, contorted her features. She spent the next hour on her phone, her voice escalating from imperious commands to shrill, desperate threats. The answer from every banker was the same polite, unyielding, and legally absolute. Her access was gone. Her panic-stricken call to Marcus Thorne set the next stage in motion. Thorne, ever the pragmatist, was initially dismissive. He assumed it was a minor legal snarl, a loose end from the divorce. Then the official notification from Sarah Jenkins's law firm arrived. It wasn't a rambling letter. It was a crisp 100-page document with exhibits. As Thorne read, his professional curiosity turned to disbelief and then to a cold, sinking dread. He wasn't looking at a frivolous claim. He was looking at a masterpiece of asset concealment that had just catastrophically backfired on his late client. He recognized the legal structures. He understood the implications. Richard Sterling, the master of the game, had been checkmated by a ghost. Thorne requested the emergency meeting. Sarah agreed, setting the time and place. The home field advantage was theirs. The atmosphere in Sarah Jenkins' conference room was a study in contrasts. It was a practical working space. Law books lined the walls, a whiteboard still held faint traces of their investigation, and the coffee was strong. It was a world away from the opulent mahogany-paneled rooms where Richard Sterling had made his deals. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. She wore a simple navy blue dress. There was no jewelry, save for her late mother's simple gold watch. She looked not like a billionaire, but like a woman comfortable in her own skin for the first time in decades. Her calm was a placid lake, and Amber, when she stormed in, was a tempest. "What is the meaning of this?" Amber demanded, skipping any pretense of civility. She was flanked by Marcus Thorne, whose face was a grim, unreadable mask. "This is harassment. It's an illegal asset seizure, and I will have you both disbarred and thrown in jail." Sarah Jenkins simply gestured to the chairs opposite them. "Please have a seat. I assure you everything we have done is perfectly legal. Peterson, the forensic accountant, sat silently to Sarah's right, a stack of files in front of him. Let's not waste time with theatrics, Ms. Croft. Sarah began, her tone even and professional. 15 years ago, Richard Sterling, with the assistance of his financial advisor, established a holding company in Delaware. It was called Vance Holdings, Inc. Here, she said, sliding a document across the polished table, is a copy of the incorporation certificate. As you can see, the sole director and officer listed is Eleanor Vance Sterling. Thorne picked it up, his eyes scanning the page with the speed of long practice. He said nothing. Over the next decade and a half, Sarah continued, Mr. Sterling used this entity and several others under its umbrella to acquire a number of, shall we say, pristine assets. She nodded to Peterson. He placed a second file on the table. Exhibit A. The deed to the commercial property at 451 Rodeo Drive, Beverly Hills. Purchased for cash. Title is held by Vance Real Estate, a wholly owned subsidiary of Vance Holdings. He placed another file on top of it. Exhibit B, the portfolio statement from Goldman Sachs for EV Investments. Current market value, as of this morning, is approximately $872 million. The account owner is listed as Eleanor Vance. File after file landed on the table. The deed to the villa on Lake Como. The ownership certificate for the Sterling Blue Diamond. A detailed inventory of the art collection purchased through the Vance Trust. Each document was a hammer blow cracking the foundation of Amber's inherited world. Amber stared, her breath coming in ragged bursts. It's a forgery. It's all fake. Richard would never. He loved me. He left everything to me. She shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through Amber's hysteria. He left you Sterling properties, Amber. I heard the will, just as you did. He was very specific. He left you the company, the brand, the public-facing empire. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with Amber's. Did he ever tell you about the company's debt load? The bond covenants, the personal guarantees he made that are now tied to the corporate assets? He left you a very complicated, very leveraged, and very public job. You wanted to be queen. Well, he gave you the crown. It's just much, much heavier than you imagined. Marcus Thorne finally spoke, his voice raspy. My client's intention. Intention is a sentiment, Marcus, Sarah interjected smoothly, not a legal title. Richard Sterling's intention was to hide his most valuable assets from any potential creditor litigant or market collapse. And he chose to hide them behind the one person he believed would never look, his quiet wife. He used her name, her signature, and her trust to build a financial fortress. This is a scheme, a fraud, Amber yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. You were in on it. Eleanor offered a sad, tired smile. No, that was his greatest mistake. I wasn't in on it. I knew nothing. And he was so certain of that, so confident in his underestimation of me, that he never bothered to protect himself from his own death. He planned, I'm sure, to take it all back at his leisure. But he ran out of time, so the assets remain with their legal owner. Me. Peterson slid one final sheet of paper onto the center of the table. It was a summary balance sheet. At the bottom, a single number was circled in red ink. 2,814. 550,000. Amber stared at the number as if it were a serpent. The fight visibly drained from her, replaced by a grey, hollow shock. She slumped back in her chair, all the fire extinguished. She had won the battle for Richard's affection, for his public life, for his name. But she had just discovered that the entire war had been a feint. The real prize had been secretly surrendered to her enemy long before she had even arrived on the battlefield. Thorne, recognizing the legal checkmate, cleared his throat. "My client will need some time to review these documents." It was the closest he would come to admitting defeat. "Take all the time you need," Sarah said. "The facts will remain the same." As Amber and Thorne left defeated and silent, Eleanor remained seated, looking not triumphant, but profoundly weary. The ghost of her husband, the man of immense genius and even more immense arrogance, had finally been laid to rest. The aftermath was not a life of revenge or ostentatious display. It was a quiet, deliberate reclamation. Eleanor's first act was to visit the Park Avenue penthouse one last time. Escorted by Sarah, she walked through the cold marble rooms. It was a museum of a life that was never truly hers. She didn't feel sadness or anger, only a detached sense of closure. She instructed the estate managers to liquidate everything: the apartment, the furniture, the cars. She kept nothing except a small, unremarkable painting of a Boston street scene that had belonged to her mother, which Richard had always relegated to a guest bathroom. The vast river of money that flowed from the liquidation of the Vance assets was channeled into a single, powerful entity, the Vance Foundation. Eleanor threw herself into its creation with the same passion she had once reserved for her art history studies. Her mission was clear and a direct refutation of Richard's legacy. His philanthropy had been about ego, about etching the sterling name onto buildings. Hers would be about impact. The Vance Foundation focused on two core principles: supporting brilliant, under-recognized artists, particularly women, and funding robust art education programs in public schools. She didn't want to buy Picassos. She wanted to fund the next Picasso. Her first major project was the endowment of a new wing at the Brooklyn Museum. When the museum board asked what she wanted it to be called, she smiled. "Just call it the Contemporary Arts Wing. The art is the point, not my name." She did not move to a palace. She bought a magnificent light-filled brownstone on a tree-lined street in Carroll Gardens, a short walk from her old, tiny apartment. She spent months renovating it, not to be a showpiece, but to be a home. Bookshelves replaced gilded mirrors. A comfortable, sun-drenched studio replaced a formal, unused dining room. The walls were filled with the works of the vibrant, emerging artists her foundation was now supporting. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the will reading, Eleanor sat in her studio, the sun warming her face. Her blog, Vance's Vision, had become the official journal of her foundation, its essays read and respected by critics and curators worldwide. She was writing an article about a young sculptor from the Bronx whose work she had just acquired for a new public installation. She paused, looking out of the window at the children playing in the garden below. The sterling blue diamond had been sold to a private collector, and the proceeds had just funded an entire decade's worth of art supplies for every public school in the city. The Testarossa was gone, and in its place 100 scholarships for promising art students had been endowed. Richard had tried to value her at $10,000. He had built a secret multi-billion-dollar kingdom in her name as the ultimate act of control. But his true final legacy, she realized, was not the one he had written in his will. It was the one he had unintentionally given her the power to create. He had built his empire to hoard beauty and power for himself. She would use it to give it back to the world. And in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by art that was alive with new ideas, Eleanor Vance finally understood the true value of $1 and of a life well lived. It was a fortune Richard Sterling, for all his genius, had never come close to possessing. Eleanor's story is a stunning testament to resilience and the extraordinary power of quiet strength. It's a story about how the person you underestimate the most can often be the one holding all the cards. Richard Sterling thought he was playing a game of chess, but he never realized his queen had a will of her own. Her journey from a humiliated wife to a philanthropic powerhouse reminds us that true wealth isn't about what you own, but about the legacy you build and the purpose you find. It's a powerful lesson in looking closer, reading the fine print of our own lives, and never ever letting anyone else define our worth. If Eleanor's incredible story of poetic justice and quiet triumph moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to take back control. And for more unforgettable real-life stories like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. What part of Eleanor's story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.